Hello, good morning, JCIP. I'm Hydra Rosales. They introduced me earlier in the first installment of this webinar as the girl from Pagadian. So I'm not affiliated to JCI yet, but I'm helping out the team for the debate. This is going to be the fourth installment of the webinar for your debate 101. This is going to be, I'm going to talk about a very important topic as well, and it's also my favorite topic. So we're going to talk about responsiveness. So we've already talked about the format of the Asian parliamentary procedure. Elio talked about the themes and the themes for the motions. Dino earlier also talked about argumentation. So essentially, this part is going to talk about responsiveness in the debate. Why is it important to talk about responsiveness? Because responsiveness or rebuttals or the ability to respond in the debate is also as important as the ability to build constructives or the ability to build argumentations or arguments. You have to remember that winning a debate isn't just about building your case or building constructives, but most of it also, a lot of debates are won or lost because of responsiveness, because some debaters are not able to respond to the arguments of the other side, or they were unable to respond again once their arguments were attacked, or once their arguments were attacked with the other side also, or the other side of the house. So the next step is I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can follow us quickly as well and easily. So there. So we're going to talk about responsiveness. So as I mentioned earlier, this pertains to how debaters actually answer points of their opponents relative to their own. So this ability is as important as the skill to deliver an argument, because debates are won by two things: your constructives, the arguments, as what Dino discussed, the meat of the debate or the meat of your speech, and as well as your ability to damage the arguments or the side or the other side. So it is a function of responses as well. So before we discuss how you can respond or the different kinds of rebuttals, responsiveness or responding to or responses, actually, it's 4 a.m. I'm Sabaw. Responses come in various forms, but we're going to talk about two different scenarios for today. So the first is essentially when your argument has not been responded to. In such case, our responses, it's important to point out to the adjudicator or to the house that the opponent actually failed to respond to your argument, that they actually just ignored it, and they were simply just unable to respond. And then it's a good point and a good chance for you to highlight how good the argument was, or how the other side of the house actually failed in their role to respond to you. Another also, the second is the second purpose of responding or rebuttals is when your argument or your teammate's argument has suffered from an opponent's attack. So when your opponent actually did respond to the previous speaker. So the purpose here is to be able to reanalyze your argument and to rebuild it, and to give fresh analysis to it and give additional relevance and weight to your argumentation, because that's also important. So at the same time, the second form or the second instance of responding is to undermine the opponent's rebuttal. So here you can point out how the rebuttal was actually ineffective, or how the rebuttal of your opponent wasn't necessarily relevant in the debate. So how do you respond? In crafting responses, debaters, as you can see, debaters must consider that its prime objective is essentially to show that their opponents are wrong. Either one, they're wrong, or they're irrelevant. So here in your module, we say that there are two ways. But before that, I'd just like to add another one in terms of how you respond. Is the first level of responsiveness would be on to show, this is what we call a technical rebuttal. Essentially, it answers whether or not the speakers before you were able to answer the important questions in an argument. So as what Dino discussed in the earlier webinar, he discussed about how to make an argument. So the questions that you have to ask in the argument. So this is a status quo. This is what's happening in current situation. Why, you have to answer the why, the how, and the so what. So one way to effectively respond, or one way to effectively undermine your the rebuttals, or sorry, I'm too sleepy already. To undermine your opponent's argumentation is for you to be able to point out technically that they didn't really do their part. So that's a first level of trying to rebut and to respond. The next is assuming that they actually did do their part effectively and answer those relevant questions that Dino pointed out earlier. The first type and second type of rebuttal or responsiveness is to prove to the House that the argument of your opposition is actually not true. It's factually false. So that's the second way to do it, and we'll show examples later on. And the third way to do it is to point out that even if their arguments, or even if their points were true or probable, you have to show that even if they were true, these are insignificant. Primarily, the point is insignificant or irrelevant to the debate because either one, the principle that you are fighting for, or the principle that you're actually arguing for in your side of the House, is of a higher value versus the point that your opponent actually pointed out. And the second way to do it is to show harms versus benefits. Essentially, you show that their side, even if it's true, creates more harm, or that your House or your side of the House actually creates more benefits versus the harms that your opponent actually presented earlier on. So for a better understanding, let's look at the one example. The first example is, I think this is something that Dino also discussed earlier on the same motion, so we can jump off from that. So the first is on the argument or the debate that labor makes a child unduly vulnerable to physical and psychological harm. So the handle is that labor makes a child unduly vulnerable to physical and psychological harm. So the explanation there is that our society and government has always recognized that a child or children are vulnerable in the society, therefore they have to be protected. And because they're vulnerable, they're children, there are higher risks for children to have or to incur psychological or physical problems when you subject them to labor or when you make them work. It's important to listen to the context and to listen to the labels of your opponent. So here they say that the child is subjected to unduly vulnerability, which means that you are subjecting a child to vulnerability that's unnecessary, or something that should be avoided given the current context. So one way to do that is to show one way to respond to that is to show that even if one is to show that this isn't necessarily true, so you can analyze that the reason why the children are actually doing child labor is because it's actually really necessary, because the family, either one, you can say that the family have already exhausted all other options for labor. Either the parents are unable to work, or even if the parents are working, it's not enough to sustain the family, or that they have already exhausted all possible alternatives, even government support, that makes it necessary for the child to actually go through labor and for the child to actually work for the family. So therefore, in that type of response, you've already addressed that the argument or the basis of your opponent isn't necessarily true, because their argumentation was mainly based on the idea or the principle that this is unnecessary labor. So therefore, you've already proven that actually that's not true, because labor here from the child is actually necessary. So another way to do it also, let's use the same argument so that we can understand it better. So that's the one that it's not true. So that's how you respond. The first level is the argument isn't true. The labor from the child is actually still necessary. Next is the second level of response would be that even if this is true, even if it's really unnecessary, you have to defend the principles from your side of the house are greater versus the principles that your opponents actually say. So for this side, for this example, for this argument, or for this one, what you can actually say for the even if response is that even if it was really unnecessary, you think that the benefits actually outweigh the harms, because primarily maybe number one, it's still additional income from for the family, and that's more important than the psychological or physical problems that the child will actually go through, because these are things that can be preempted, or these are things that can still be addressed anyway, or you can prove that there really isn't any psychological or physical harm that the child gets. Okay, someone's waving on my screen. So that's how you respond. That's how you can actually try to damage the case of the opposition. So one, again, is to say that that's the simplest way to do it, to go about it in terms of being responsive in an argument. Number one, show that technically the argument didn't make sense, or the speaker actually didn't answer the necessary questions to be answered for the particular argumentation. Or number two, you say that the argument or the statement is false and show examples and prove to the house how it really isn't true, and that status quo, or what the real, and paint a picture of what the reality actually is. And second is to show to them that even if that argument or that statement is true, what your paradigm is actually fighting for is more important, because one, the principle that you want to uphold is of a higher value than what the other side of the house actually painted. Or number two, that your harms, the harms outweigh the benefits, or the benefits outweigh the harms. So those are actually some of the very simple ways, or the basic ways that you can respond to the different arguments. That's Dino's hand. So essentially, that's how to respond in the different, Dino, to the different, it's Roland. I think LA is asleep somewhere. So that's how you respond in debates and to actually make effective rebuttals. So responding and having rebuttals are as equally important as building argumentations at the end of the day, because debates are won by either constructives, or they can also be lost because of the inability to respond. So hopefully that was helpful in terms of knowing how to respond properly in the debate. And hopefully this webinar was very informative and helpful for the NatCon. And this guys and LA is asleep. We'll see you there. Bye!